Some argue that the term fascism functions as little more than a political slur. As history professor Bruce Klucklick writes, the term fascism has functioned in public life primarily to denigrate and insult, operating as the rhetorical equivalent of throwing a tomato at a speaker at a public event. And certainly there is at the very least instability in its usage, but not all uses are equal. And I would argue that now more than ever, fascism, defined broadly as militaristic nationalism and a contempt for liberalism and electoral politics, should be called out at every turn. But why? Although far from an erotic thriller, Bertram Gross's 1980 book Friendly Fascism will nonetheless leave you in a state of intense frustration. How could someone give such a clear warning of what was to come decades prior? Why didn't we do anything? One reason is because of the gradual, almost slow-motion nature of friendly fascism. What is friendly fascism? Rather than relying on a militant takeover or the charismatic strongman, Gross argues that this form of fascism emerges through the political economy of transnational corporations, or, in plain terms, when those we elect become primarily influenced by private companies. This is the first step in which one of the central functions of a liberal democracy, in which the government is responsive to voters, withers away. Here I can point to endless studies that show just how often our elected representatives decide to represent corporations over those who elect them. This video is sponsored by Brilliant. Something I've always valued is the ability to think critically. However, in a world of so much information, it's tricky to know exactly how one could properly discriminate and make sense of data. In order to critically interpret research papers and articles, I needed a refresher on how math and science worked. Thankfully, there's Brilliant to turn to. Brilliant is a fun and interactive platform with an insane amount of STEM-related courses to fuel your curiosity about the world around you. With Brilliant, anyone can understand concepts about science, math, and coding. Their interactive puzzles and quizzes allow for an easy and fun path towards learning real problem solving, no matter the topic. I've been having fun going through Brilliant's course on search engines. My life is pretty much ruled by algorithms and search results, so it's been really insightful to go into exactly how computers are able to process so much data and how computers read. Visit the link in the description below to get started learning STEM for free, and the first 200 people will get 20% off their annual premium subscription. The pernicious character of friendly fascism largely resides in its non-territorial nature. Although many of these big businesses originate in the US, they are not necessarily loyal to any one nation. This is a huge difference between your typical goose-stepping fascism and friendly fascism. The nation does not need to be at the heart of it all. Instead, the nation-state functions as a mere economic unit with its leaders acting as puppets. As Gross writes, a powerful oligarchy operates outside of as well as through the state. Each subverts constitutional government. Each suppresses rising demands for wider participation in decision-making, the enforcement and enlargement of human rights. Now, if you're the average ma and pa multinational corporation, democracy is going to piss you off. People aren't voting out of the best interest of McDonald's usually. Rather, they vote in the hopes of having their needs represented and satisfied. But all of these needs, healthcare, education, workers' rights, they all get in the way of quarterly earnings. Democracy must be subtly weakened. One often cited example of how these companies view democracy is in the Trilateral Commission's 1975 report on the excess of democracy in America. In it, they argue that increased engagement of popular classes would threaten the dominance of the business world and the ability to maintain international trade relations. Thinkers such as Chomsky point to this report as a clear example of big business's hostility towards both liberal democracy and the interests of the average individual. To avoid pesky accountability, these companies function outside of the messy democratic limitations of a single state, engaging in a multi-state system that encourages, among other things, the erosion of the tax base. This then leads to shifting the burden of taxation from corporations to the individual. And then, according to Gross, this inevitably leads to a tax revolt movement within the upper middle class. Isn't this terrible for the average citizen? Why doesn't the population demand more from their representatives? Unfortunately, the commingling of big business and government slowly leads to the subversion of democratic principles and rights. Anti-war protests and civil rights rallies are repressed. The three branches of government become further integrated. Hand-picked judges would at first be activist, aggressively reversing previous court decisions and legitimating vastly greater discretion by the expanding police complex, Gross writes. The road to neo-fascism in the US would probably be paved with the granting of emergency powers to further enhance the imperial presidency. Slowly but surely, customary repression becomes a sustained mode of governance. Most of these forms of repression have been seen time and time again throughout American history. From the excessive power granted to oil companies during the 70s crisis to the Patriot Act, the average voter is left feeling powerless in the face of the establishment. These tactics, such as the destruction of unions and loss of overall political influence, function to create a world of isolated individuals at the mercy of concentrated power. As John Dewey writes, until the means of production, exchange, publicity, transportation, and communication reside in the hands of the public, politics will remain the shadow cast on society by big business. The power is not in the people, so why even try? However, as Gross argues, this sort of doom and gloom is what makes fascism so appealing. Fear paralyzes people and creates confusion. Friendly fascism finds its legitimacy, ironically, in the fear that emerges through the social conditions caused by the erosion of democratic institutions. Rather than ruling by an iron fist, friendly fascism offers us velvet gloves. The helpless population then begins to support measures that supposedly defend national security, traditional liberties, and individual well-being, even if these measures go against the rights of some. Here we see the wisdom of David Hume. As force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. 'Tis therefore on opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular. Gross notes that friendly fascism can only function with enough of the population viewing it as acceptable or even preferable. Popular opinion matters. To combat friendly fascism, we must understand the logic of this popular opinion. Why would someone defend friendly fascism? Well, it's friendly, at least depending on who you ask. Here I would discourage writing off the rise of the new right as hogs, deplorables, or somehow shallow in thought. Like Gross, this movement views the disenfranchisement of the population as a result of globalization. Elected representatives not only vote against the interests of large sections of their population, they also insult them and denigrate them for being backwards and bigoted. These individuals, experiencing a sense of cultural and economic marginalization from their lack of representation, begin to see the pluralism and openness of liberal institutions as relativistic and nihilistic, or unfriendly. The new right then offers a view of the liberal state as a place of directionless competition between competing social interests. Under the guise of equality and rights, the liberal elites control society through its domination over culture and education. And who are the supposed victims of this liberal domination? Those still tied to locality, who experience migration or cultural cosmopolitanism as a threat, as well as the deplorables who hold on to tradition, to their inherited communities and prejudices, even as they are being eroded by globalization, and who are disparaged as backward and bigoted, dependent, and if they are lucky, in need of reskilling by a liberal elite which is the condescending agent of their increasingly dire economic plight, and that dismisses and disparages their feelings of social and cultural dislocation or alienation. We cannot dismiss the experience of these groups as trivial. If anything, this is the product of lower and middle classes experiencing the burden of taxation and the loss of political influence that came about initially from the influence of transnational corporations. Nefariously, however, the new right shifts the blame on expert liberal elites rather than these companies. Liberal democracy, the very institution that could offer them political representation, is seen instead as the very cause of anxiety and fear. What was a class issue has become a cultural one. Here we see the central fascistic impulse as pointed out by Walter Benjamin. Fascism attempts to organize the newly created proletarian masses without affecting the property structure which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The new right is simply promising expression at the expense of genuine empowerment. Project 2025, a report backed by a large number of conservative partners, says the quiet part out loud. If the Republicans are elected, Project 2025 appears to be their central agenda. The report outlines an America where the president has total power over the executive branch, where there are frequent crackdowns on political dissidents and regular deployment of the national military as domestic law enforcement. Suddenly, fascism is sounding a lot less friendly. Could this be the conclusion of years of hard work by large companies to strip away Americans of their rights? To remind you, fascism runs on fear, and this is no time to concede to the fearful anxieties of the new right, an ideology that gives up on liberalism in the service of a hard managerialism that, let's face it, often sounds a lot like the fascism of old. We shouldn't be scared, but we should be extremely concerned and motivated. Gross asks us to recognize that this is not over. The very areas of our lives that friendly fascism seeks to disturb and silence, unions, ballot boxes, demonstrations, and picket lines, are those spaces where we need to show up most. Attack every step towards friendly fascism in the factories and the fields, in the offices and the supermarkets, in the courts and the legislatures, at the ballot boxes, in the classrooms, on the picket lines, in the press, and on the airwaves. Or, in the words of Viktor Frankl, a man intimately aware of the horrors of fascism, "For the world is in a bad state, but everything will become still worse unless each of us does their best."